Nabila Ramdani is a journalist who's written extensively on Libya. Nabila, you were hearing Deborah there talking about specifically what's been happening in Tripoli tonight. But what about the rest of the country? What do we know about what the impact of the last 24 hours and the aerial bombardment from the coalition forces has been?
Well, certainly the atmosphere in the rest of the country is quite different from the one in Tripoli, where we've heard that Gaddafi's residence building has been hit by airstrikes, and the Gaddafi regime is now concerned that the reports coming out of the Pentagon saying that they're not after Gaddafi are of course untrue. The atmosphere is quite different in Benghazi, where the Gaddafi tanks were advancing towards the city in spite of a ceasefire declared a few hours ago by a spokesperson of the Gaddafi regime. A French strike destroyed, Gaddafi tanks, and these were followed by scenes of euphoria and rejoicing by the rebels who were celebrating the destruction of those tanks for obvious reasons. So, we have, very different atmospheres according to where you are in the country. But of course, Tripoli remains, the stronghold of the Gaddafi regime, where all, the people loyal to him are getting even more loyal by the day because of the perceived injustice and the intrusion of foreign powers in the country.
So the intervention by the United Nations forces might actually be working against them?
Very much so, because it exposed, especially the strike on the bombing on the residence of Gaddafi exposed actually the hypocrisy in the motivation behind the UN resolution, and indeed the fact that the main aim is not so much to protect the civilian population as was stated on repeated occasion, but it's now very clear that the main aim of the UN resolution is to achieve change, and that has been made very obvious by the very fact that President Sarkozy, remember, was the first head of state to recognize the Transitional National Council as legitimate rulers of Libya. He was taken up by a statement from the US Secretary Hillary Clinton, who stated a couple of days ago that the clear aim of the UN resolution was the removal of Gaddafi.
Although ultimately that might be the aim, but there is no mandate for that from the United Nations, and still, we're hearing the Americans themselves still denying that that is what their ultimate aim is. Is it a question, or if it's a question of who do you believe, the coalition forces or Colonel Gaddafi tonight, which of those two options do Libyans believe?
Well, we are clearly in a situation of war, and the propaganda machine is working full force on both sides. Of course, reports coming out of Tripoli, especially at the beginning of the uprising, where both Colonel Gaddafi and his son, Saif al-Islam, made repeated appearances on television, denying any sort of trouble within the country, were obviously hard to believe, to say the least. We've also seen, that the ceasefire announcement were not followed by the actual actions, that the Gaddafi regime was not delivering on its promises. But at the same time, we're seeing the exact same thing on the Western Front, because it is no coincidence that the UN resolution was indeed rushed, because time was of the essence, and the whole point of passing the UN resolution so swiftly was not so much, as we are seeing now, to prevent the bloodshed in Benghazi, but indeed to prevent the fall of Benghazi, and hence prevent the end of the rebellion, making sure that Gaddafi doesn't remain in power. And that has been made abundantly clear in the recent developments.
Nabila, you've been in the region for some time now. Now, I just wondered, in terms of a comparative study, would you say that the bombardment from the coalition forces is having the desired effect, at least the apparent desired effect, which is to protect the Libyan people as a whole? Do you think it's having that effect?
I think it would have been very naive to believe that, as stated by the UN resolution, that one could bring the end, protect civilians by further militarization of the conflict, that one could stop end the violence by indeed expanding the scale of the conflict and indeed of the bloodshed, and by leading the Libyan people to believe that they were given the choice to determine their future by themselves, by telling them, we're here to remove Gaddafi. I do not believe it is clearly proving to be counterproductive, hence the fact that the UN Secretary, the Arab League, the chief of the Arab League, Amr Moussa, has been stating today that he was concerned about the civilian casualties, something which inevitably happened in the course of this war. And one has to bear in mind the effect that this will have psychologically on the Arab and indeed the Muslim world, as images will start to appear on perhaps not so much Western television screens, but very much so on Arab television, images of civilian casualties, which would be a very sinister reminder of what's happened in Iraq.
So broadly speaking, your answer is no, it's not having that effect, that desired effect.
It's proving to be very counterproductive indeed,
Nabila,
as people are showing more and more support towards Gaddafi in Libya.
Appreciate you talking to us, Nabila Ramdani there.